Hi, sophomores of ours. This is another video for Unit 3, moving on. And this is about how the Supreme Court strengthens nationalism. This focuses on the Marshall Court, and we've already learned about John Marshall when we learned about judicial review, right? We learned about what judicial review was, and we learned how Marshall helped make the judicial branch co-equal to the other two branches of government. Now, there's a lot of court cases under Marshall that strengthened the federal government. We're just going to focus on two today. It would be awesome if we could focus on all the big ones that strengthened it, but for sake of time, and I think two little case studies will give us a good idea. So the idea is that how it strengthened nationalism is that, remember, leading into the Constitutional Convention, many people were afraid that the Constitution and the federal government would take away too much of the states' rights. The anti-federalists were really concerned about this. But as time went on, the federal government grew stronger. And this were some of the examples of how that happened, okay? So the Marshall Court made the federal government more powerful. So like I said, we're going to focus on two court cases, and the first one is McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Now, just a few years earlier, the Congress created the Second National Bank of the United States. Many states saw that the bank was a powerful entity and too powerful of an entity and encroached on their states' rights a little bit much. The second bank required this tax, right? McCulloch was a cashier of a branch of that bank in Baltimore, and he was refusing to pay some of these taxes. Because what happened here is Maryland passed a state law that put lots of taxes on the national bank because they were upset about it. And McCulloch was not paying them. So now Maryland is suing McCulloch for it. Okay? So what happens? Well, the Supreme Court says there's a necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And he says the power to tax is the power to destroy. So Maryland trying to sort of tax this bank is trying to destroy it. And they say that the bank is constitutional, right? It's not unconstitutional for the national government to make this bank. So the precedent said is that there can be this loose interpretation of the necessary and proper clause, right? And that becomes a big debate. Do we interpret the Constitution word for word very strictly, or do we interpret it more loosely? That's still something people debate over today. It also said that the state cannot tax a federal institution. It could go the other way around, but the states cannot tax the federal government. So you see how this increases the power of the national government. Okay, so what Chief Justice Marshall noted is that Congress possessed powers that aren't specifically outlined in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that the Congress doesn't have them. So just because it doesn't say that the Congress can create a bank, that doesn't mean that the Congress can't create a bank. And that's that loose interpretation. Okay. Now, the court ruled that Maryland did not have the power to pass those taxes on the bank, as we said. And this has other effects besides the precedents that it set. It said that the Congress did have the power to create the bank, like we said, which strengthened that elastic clause and a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Also, it reinforced the supremacy clause. So if you follow the arrow there, Marshall wrote, "The Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof are supreme. They control the Constitution and laws of the respective states and cannot be controlled by them." So in other words, sort of like the federal government outranks the state government, if you want to. That's the supremacy clause. It also showed judicial review on state laws. So not only can the Supreme Court say that federal laws are unconstitutional, they can also say that state laws are unconstitutional. And many times today, why cases go to the Supreme Court are the Supreme Court considering whether certain state laws are constitutional or not. So that's used very much today. So you can really see how this is an example of strengthening nationalism and really shaping the court to do things that it does to this day. Okay, so the Elastic Clause granted Congress the authority to make laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the work of the federal government. So basically, anything that needs to help the federal government run, the Congress can make laws about that. That's the Elastic Clause. Here's another case, Gibbons versus Ogden, which is a couple years later in 1824. If you notice, that picture in the background is the Hudson River. If you've been to New York City or you've been on the Hudson River before, and it goes quite a ways up in New York. And it was a very important river it was a big river when you think of militarily in the French and Indian War and our Revolution and things like that. It was also really important a river for transport, for commerce. To this day, if you do go to the Hudson River, there's huge boats carrying cargo down it. They're huge. Sometimes I wonder how deep is that river when I see them. And you still see even trains right along the shoreline. It's a really important route. Anyway, New York State gave Ogden a monopoly over ferrying on the Hudson River. Monopoly being like, no others can really compete with you. But the federal Congress gave Gibbons the same license to do that. So you have the state government saying, this is the only one that can flow down this river in New York, and the federal government saying, this is the only one that can ferry down this river. So who do you choose? New York said, hey, Gibbons, you're violating our state law. Now, Ogden claimed that he had exclusive rights to operate his steamboat business, right? Because the New York State gave him this license. So the federal license was null and void. This would be that states' rights claim, okay? But remember, now you have the national government sort of outranking the states. So the decision was states cannot usurp the authority of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. So this ruling strengthened the role, once again, of the federal government, especially when it came to interstate commerce. By the way, a lawyer for this case was Daniel Webster. He was, a member of the House of Representatives, a big guy in politics. I mention it because you may have read The Devil and Daniel Webster in English class. I don't know. I know I had to do an English class back in the day. If you did, tell me, and if you didn't, tell me too, I guess. Maybe something we can discuss. Anyway, the ruling was said that this navigation is interstate commerce. State monopolies over interstate commerce now became null and void. So you couldn't enforce these interstate monopolies. It promoted free enterprise, which, think about this. This is during the Industrial Revolution. This is important, right? It also gave state power to grant monopolies. So even if it was in your state and not interstate, it really limited them. And it really, I'm being repetitive here, but I want you to get the point. The court power is that the federal government could regulate interstate commerce. Okay, this is pretty short, but I just want you to get the idea that these court cases increase the power of the federal government and reduce the power of state governments, and really further help to shape the powers of the Supreme Court and make it a more equal and even a more powerful branch. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know. We will review the outlines again in class.